Welcome back, everyone. We're about to take a deep dive into a topic that's both fascinating and, frankly, a bit unsettling: stolen African art.
Yeah, it's a really complex issue.
It is. We're going to be exploring how Britain acquired thousands of African artifacts during the colonial period.
It's a story that's often overlooked, but it's crucial to understand the impact of colonialism on African culture and heritage.
Exactly. We're going to be looking at specific examples of stolen artifacts.
And also the ongoing efforts to repatriate these objects. It's a really important conversation happening right now about who owns these pieces of history.
It is. And get this, our journey starts in a seemingly quiet town in Nigeria called Chibok. You might recognize that name.
Oh yeah, from that tragic event a few years back.
Exactly. But the story of Chibok runs much deeper, way back to the colonial period. We're talking about a long history of resistance against British colonization.
It's amazing how these stolen artifacts aren't just beautiful artworks. I mean, they are that, but they're also like missing puzzle pieces.
Missing pieces of what?
Of history. They hold deep historical and cultural significance. They could help us understand the complete picture of African civilizations.
Right. Because without those pieces, we only get one side of the story.
Exactly.
So, okay, back to Chibok. It's 1906. The British launch what they call a punitive expedition against the town. They said it was because the Chibok people were raiding British trade routes.
Punitive expedition. That sounds loaded.
Oh, it is, but here's where it gets really interesting. The people of Chibok fought back. They resisted with poisoned arrows for 11 days.
Wow, they held out for 11 days against the British Army. That's incredible.
It is. And you know what's striking? That act of bravery, that resistance, it's often left out of the official narrative.
Oh, I see where you're going with this. So those arrows, where are they now?
They're in the British Museum. But guess what? The label doesn't mention Chibok's resistance at all.
No way. So they're just presented as artifacts with no context.
It's like they're trying to erase history. Like those labels are saying, hey, look at this interesting object. But not. These arrows were used by the Chibok people to defend their land and their way of life.
It's like they're silencing the voices of the people who made them.
Exactly. And it makes you think, whose story is being told when we look at these objects in museums?
Right. It's usually the story of the colonizers, the victors. We rarely get to hear the perspective of the people who were colonized.
It's about time we acknowledge their side of the story, their agency, their resilience.
Absolutely.
And speaking of shifting narratives, let's talk about how Britain's relationship with Africa changed after they abolished the slave trade.
Yeah, that's a whole other can of worms.
Because they still needed to find a way to maintain their wealth and power, right?
Exactly. They turned to what they called legitimate commerce. Sounds nice, but it wasn't really.
What did it actually involve?
Basically forcing African labor to produce resources for British industries. So it was like they swapped one exploitative system for another.
So it wasn't really about ethical progress. More like, okay, we can't have slaves anymore, but we still need to make money off these people.
Sadly, yeah. It was about finding a new way to exploit resources and maintain control.
A guy named MacGregor Laird, he really embodies that mindset. He saw forced labor for palm oil production as a, get this, more humane and profitable alternative to slavery.
You're kidding me. More humane. How did he justify that?
He actually calculated that a free African, as he called them, could produce 3 times as much palm oil as an enslaved person.
Wow. It's horrifying how they could dehumanize people like that, reducing them to units of production just to turn a profit.
And to make it even worse, the first documented artifact stolen from Nigeria, this Yoruba stool, it now bears the name of the British explorer who took it.
Wait, seriously? It's named after him?
Richard Lander. And where is it today?
I bet I can guess. In the British Museum.
Adding insult to injury. Right. It's like a physical manifestation of the erasure of African history. And honestly, this is just the tip of the iceberg.
It was just the beginning of a much larger system of exploitation and cultural theft.
Exactly. And a big part of that system was the Royal Niger Company, the RNC. They were instrumental in colonizing vast parts of Africa.
The RNC? Weren't they like a private company?
They were, but led by this guy, George Goldie. They had incredible power, a monopoly on trade.
And you're saying they used that power to exploit resources and control local population?
Absolutely. They used brutal tactics, often indistinguishable from the violence of the slave trade era. Burning villages, imposing these crazy tariffs that crippled African merchants.
So basically a reign of terror designed to crush any resistance.
And get this, they tricked African leaders into signing treaties they couldn't even read.
No way! How did they pull that off?
Often in exchange for like a bottle of gin.
Seriously, a bottle of gin for control of their land and resources. That's just unbelievable.
We even have an account from a British MP at the time, Henry Labouchere, confirming this deception. It's a blatant disregard for basic human rights.
Absolutely. But even in the face of this exploitation, there was resistance.
Oh, tell me about it.
Well, like the Ekumeku movement. It's a powerful example of the Igbo people fighting back against the RNC in the Delta State.
See, there was always pushback. People weren't just letting this happen.
Exactly. They were fighting for their land, their resources, their culture.
It's inspiring. And this whole focus on controlling resources, it leads us to another dark chapter, punitive expeditions. They used these to attack African kingdoms that resisted British control.
Oh, those punitive expeditions. More like thinly veiled excuses for violence and looting.
Right. Like, a prime example is the 1892 attack on the Yoruba kingdom of Ijebu. Their king, he controlled trade routes to coastal ports, which, of course, the British wanted access to.
So he's in their way. What happened?
He refuses to comply with their demands. Boom! Full-scale attack. They use Maxim guns. Just devastating loss of life on the Ijebu side.
And what happened after the attack? I think we can guess.
You know it. They looted Ijebu artifacts. Many of them are in museums now.
It's the same pattern again and again. Violence, theft, and erasure of history.
It really is. And sadly, things were about to get even worse. You see, around this time, quinine was discovered. This drug could prevent malaria.
So that's a good thing, right? A medical advancement.
It was, but it also had unintended consequences. It meant that Europeans could now venture into the African interior. Before, they couldn't really get past the coast without succumbing to malaria.
Oh, no. So it opened the door for even more exploitation.
Exactly. It was like a green light for further colonization and theft of African resources and cultural heritage.
And sadly, this pattern of violence and theft, it just repeats itself over and over.
Oof, it's disheartening.
Yeah. So let's look at one of the most well-known cases of cultural theft, okay? The Benin Expedition of 1897.
The Benin bronzes, everyone's heard of those.
Right. It's still a huge point of contention between Britain and Nigeria.
They've become almost a symbol, you know, for this kind of cultural theft.
Yeah, they've taken on this symbolic meaning. But it's important to remember they're more than just beautiful art pieces, which they are, don't get me wrong.
I get it. There's more to the story.
So much more. The Benin bronzes are historical records.
Like literally. They tell a story.
They capture the achievements, the beliefs, the history of the Benin Kingdom.
It's like losing a whole chapter of history. Or more.
Right. It's a huge loss for the people of Benin. A loss of identity, of memory.
So can you paint us a picture of Benin City before the British got there?
Okay, imagine a sophisticated kingdom, right? They had impressive architecture, street lighting, a really organized society. It stood in stark contrast to the kingdoms around it that were crumbling under the pressure of colonialism.
So Benin City was thriving.
It was. But the British, of course, they had their own skin on things.
Let me guess. They were the good guys.
Ha, right. They claimed they were saving the Benin people from barbarism.
Oh, that old chestnut.
But it was just an excuse to seize control, you know,
Right.
of valuable resources like palm oil, rubber.
Classic colonial rhetoric. We're here to help.
Right. We're the civilized ones. It's sickening.
It's all about greed, isn't it?
Absolutely. And to make matters worse, we actually have evidence that suggests this looting was premeditated.
Really?
Yeah. There's a letter from Captain Phillips, the leader of the British expedition. He actually suggests that they could find enough ivory in the Benin king's palace to cover the expenses of removing the king.
So they were already planning to loot the palace before they even got there?
It's pretty clear. The British were motivated by profit, by power. These punitive expeditions were just a cover.
And the result of all this? Benin City burned, and they seized over 3,000 artifacts.
Gone. Scattered across museums worldwide. It's hard to fathom the scale of the loss.
It's just wrong.
It is. The moral and legal arguments for the return of the Benin bronzes are strong. These objects were stolen, plain and simple, through violence and illegal acts.
It needs to be rectified.
It does. But sadly, the story of stolen African artifacts doesn't end with the Benin bronzes.
There's more.
Oh, yeah. Another striking example is the gold treasures looted from the Asante Kingdom in Ghana.
Oh, wow. I don't know much about that.
Well, in 1874, the British attack Kumasi, the Asante capital. They destroyed the royal palace.
Just like in Benin.
Exactly. And they forced the Asante leaders to sign this treaty, ceding Asante lands and imposing a hefty gold payment.
So again, they're using military force to extract resources and valuables.
The pattern repeats. And many of those Asante treasures, guess what? They ended up being auctioned off in London.
Of course they did.
Even at Gerrard, you know, that crown jeweler, it still operates today. It's just unbelievable.
Exactly. It's these objects imbued with so much cultural and historical significance, they're just treated as commodities to be bought and sold.
Exactly. It highlights this lasting legacy of colonialism and the struggle to reclaim these treasures.
It really does. And it makes you wonder, what's the impact of these losses, How does the absence of these objects affect the communities they were taken from?
The impact is huge. It's not just missing objects, it's missing history, missing identity, missing cultural heritage. It creates this void.
Like, I'm picturing this exhibition I saw in Nairobi, Invisible Inventories. They used empty shelves to symbolize the vast number of Kenyan objects that are still in the UK.
That's powerful. It's a physical representation of the absence.
And then there are just shocking cases, like the Nandi chief, Koitalel Arap Samoei. They returned his personal belongings, but his skull, it's still in Britain.
Oh, that's awful. It's dehumanizing, treating human remains like trophies.
That's heartbreaking.
And the emotional and spiritual significance of these objects, we can't underestimate that. Nana Oforiata Ayim, she talked about sensing a lingering energy and a feeling of displacement among African objects stored in Western museums.
Right, it's like a disconnect. They're out of place.
They don't belong there. They belong with their communities.
So let's talk about restitution. Do you think loans are a good solution?
Well, it's a step, I guess, but it doesn't address the core issue: ownership and control. These communities deserve to own their heritage.
Not just borrow it back.
Exactly. It requires a complete shift in mindset. We have to acknowledge the injustice and commit to righting those wrongs.
It's not about temporary access. It's about restoring what was unjustly taken. Have there been any positive developments, towards actual restitution?
Actually, yeah. There's growing momentum, starting with Macron, the French president.
Oh, yeah. In 2017, he said African heritage can't be a prisoner of European museums.
Right. It was a big deal. It led to the Savoy-Sarr report, which laid out a plan for restitution. They found that 95% of African cultural heritage is held overseas.
Wow. That's a staggering number.
It is, and it was a wake-up call for many institutions.
So we're seeing some progress.
We are. Germany is committed to returning Benin bronzes. Some UK institutions are making pledges too, like Cambridge University's Jesus College.
It seems like things are moving in the right direction.
Yeah, and we can't forget the impact of Black Lives Matter.
You're right. It's had a huge impact on this conversation.
It's forced institutions to confront their colonial past, their complicity in systems of oppression, but there's a but.
Yeah.
We can't let restitution just become an academic debate, right? We have to move beyond talk and get those artifacts back.
Actions speak louder than words.
Exactly. Azu Nogogu, he's the founder of the Lagos Photo Festival, he said it perfectly. Restitution has become commodified, just like everything else that relates to Africa and its diaspora.
It's so true. It feels like it's become a topic for Western experts to debate, instead of a process driven by the communities who lost their heritage.
Right. We need to shift the focus, empower African communities to reclaim their own heritage.
And thankfully, there are some initiatives that are doing just that.
Oh, absolutely. There's Lagos Photo's Home Museum, the African Artists Foundation's Generator. These are fostering cultural custodianship, giving African voices a platform. They're taking control instead of waiting for Western institutions to hand things back.
It's about time.
What else? Nana Oforiata Ayim, she has this mobile museum in Ghana. It's a community-driven approach, creating a museum that reflects the needs of the people, not some Western institution.
It's about letting communities engage with their heritage on their own terms.
Exactly. This isn't just about objects, it's about people. Restoring a sense of ownership, identity, pride, healing the wounds of the past. It's about creating a more just future.
And that requires a shift in mindset, doesn't it?
It does. We have to decolonize our thinking, our institutions.
It's a long, complex process.
Yeah.
But necessary.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And thankfully, there are so many people, so many organizations working to make it happen.
It's encouraging. So what are some key developments? What should we be paying attention to?
Well, there are some really ambitious projects underway, like the Pan-African Heritage World Museum in Ghana. It's going to be a global center for celebrating African heritage.
That's fantastic.
And then there's the Great Museum of Africa in Algeria. The African Union is behind that.
These museums, they have the potential to be transformative.
They do. It's a shift in power, a reclaiming of the narrative.
It's about celebrating African heritage on a global stage.
Exactly. And the African Union is also developing a model law report.
What's that?
It's to harmonize restitution approaches for member states. It could be a major step forward in getting these objects back.
Wow. It sounds like there's a lot of positive energy and determination.
There is. And Nigeria, they've been particularly vocal in their demands.
They've been very proactive.
They're leading the way. They've been pursuing both legal and diplomatic avenues to reclaim their heritage.
I read that they even established a special body, the Legacy Restoration Trust, right, to manage negotiations with foreign museums.
They did. It's an independent body, so it ensures continuity no matter what happens with Nigerian politics.
That's smart. Shows their commitment. And have they had any success? Have they gotten anything back?
They have. They've reached agreements with institutions in the U.S., Germany, Ireland, even the U.K.
No way. That's amazing.
It is. But it's not always easy, especially when dealing with institutions like the British Museum.
They're kind of notorious for being difficult.
Yeah. They're reluctant to commit to full repatriation.
They keep offering loans instead. But Nigeria said no to that, right?
Right. They see loans as a temporary fix. Their goal is full ownership.
It's about control over their own cultural heritage.
Exactly. And it raises important questions about power dynamics and the legacy of colonialism. Who has the right to decide the fate of these objects?
It's a big question.
Mm-hmm.
And it sounds like there's still a long road ahead. But from what you've said, there's also a lot of hope. There's momentum behind this movement.
Definitely. But it's important to remember this isn't just about objects. It's about people, restoring a sense of justice, of dignity, of cultural pride to communities that have been wronged.
It's about righting historical wrongs and creating a more just and equitable future. So as we wrap up, what's the one thing you want our listeners to take away from all this?
It is a long road. There are logistical hurdles,
Right.
Legal complexities.
Complicated.
And sometimes there's resistance from institutions.
Oh, I bet. They don't want to let go of those objects.
Exactly. So even if the will is there, getting those artifacts back is a whole other battle.
What kind of legal challenges are we talking about?
Well, a lot of Western museums operate under laws that basically prevent them from removing items from their collections.
So even if they wanted to return something, they couldn't.
Sometimes, yeah. It's called deaccessioning. And in some cases, it's just not allowed.
Can you give me an example?
Sure. The British Museum, they're governed by this act from 1963. It prohibits them from permanently removing objects.
Except for very specific circumstances, I'm guessing.
You got it. It's a major obstacle.
So what can be done about that? Are there any efforts to change these laws?
Yes, actually. France passed a law in 2020 that allows for the return of African objects.
Wow. Really?
Yeah, they're acknowledging the injustice of colonialism and making a real effort to rectify it.
That's fantastic. It sounds like the tide is turning.
It is slowly but surely. Public awareness is growing. And there's pressure on other countries like the UK to follow suit.
So there's hope for legislative change.
Mm-hmm.
But what can be done in the meantime? While those restrictive laws were still in place.
Well, even with those limitations, there are ways to work around them, like long-term loans.
Oh, the objects can go back.
Yeah.
Even if ownership doesn't officially change hands.
Exactly. It's not always black and white. There's room for creative solutions.
And each case is different.
Right, of course. It's not one size fits all. The approach has to be tailored to the specific circumstances.
Okay, so let's zoom in on Nigeria. They've been really vocal about getting their artifacts back.
Oh, yeah. They've been a leading force in the movement for African restitution. They're not backing down.
What have they been doing?
They're pursuing every avenue. Legal challenges, diplomacy. They've even established a dedicated body, the Legacy Restoration Trust, to manage these negotiations.
So they're taking this seriously. It's not just talk.
It's action. They're in it for the long haul. The trust is independent, too, so it provides continuity.
That's clever.
Yeah.
No matter who's in power, the work continues.
Exactly. And they've had some wins, too. Agreements with institutions in the U.S., Germany, Ireland, even the UK.
They're getting things back. That's amazing.
It is. But it's not a smooth ride. There are still challenges, especially with places like the British Museum.
They're still holding out, aren't they?
Yeah, they're offering loans. But Nigeria is firm. They want full ownership.
They're not compromising.
It's a matter of principle. It goes back to those questions of power and the legacy of colonialism. Who gets to decide?
It's a tough situation.
Mm-hmm.
But it sounds like there's a lot of hope,
Yeah.
a lot of energy behind this movement.
There is. And it's important to remember what this is really about. It's not just about objects. It's about people.
It's about justice, dignity, cultural pride.
Exactly. It's about healing those wounds and creating a future where African heritage is celebrated and where African voices are heard.
It's been an incredible journey exploring this topic with you.
It's been my pleasure. It's so important to keep these conversations going.
It is. So to our listeners, thank you for joining us on this deep dive. We encourage you to keep learning, keep asking questions, and keep pushing for change, because this is a marathon, not a sprint. Every voice matters.
Remember, these artifacts aren't just objects. They're pieces of history, identity, cultural memory, their return. It's about restoring a sense of wholeness, of belonging, of pride.
It's about reclaiming the narrative and ensuring that African voices are heard, respected, celebrated. Thank you again for listening.